David, great to have you with us and discussing this book. I mean, just looking at what you've covered in the book, you've covered the whole of the continent, and you looked into Africa since the 1960s, social factors, governance factors, economic factors. I'm guessing this is quite a thick book because I haven't seen it as yet.
Oh, yes, it is. It's quite a thick book. It's about 355 pages. It basically seeks to examine Africa as an investment opportunity. It explores the economic appeal of Africa from a consumer markets perspective.
From a consumer markets perspective, and of course from a perspective where everyone is wanting information on Africa, was that really the catalyst that drove you to perhaps look at Africa from a bird's eye perspective and look at the key areas of interest that a potential investor would have on the continent?
Absolutely, absolutely. My motivation to write this book is two-pronged. The first one is that there is now a refocus on Africa from the rest of the world in terms of new and emerging investment opportunities. And so there is rising and growing demand for information about Africa. And I too, as a practitioner in the capital markets, continue to find lots of inquiries, lots of search for information about Africa, within Africa and from outside of Africa. The challenge has been that there has not been that much information and well-organized information about Africa, and especially orderly information that gives the points to the emergence of Africa and its economic appeal. And so there has existed for a considerable period of time a stalemate between demand for information on Africa, which is overwhelming, which is growing, and supply, which continues to be very worrying and very wanting. And so this book, therefore, attempts to bridge that chasm, that gulf between demand for information, which is rising, and supply, which is non-existent, so to speak.
David, of course, there are many questions that investors have when assessing the potential and attractiveness of a market. If you were standing in an investor's shoes right now and had to offer them advice, what were the key considerations you'd say for an investor when they look at an economy as an attractive destination or not? What are the key questions that you had to ask when assessing the various economies in Africa?
Well, the key questions are basically to start by approaching and looking at the fundamental framework or the structural framework that underpins the opportunities. And if I may go ahead to try and answer that, why Africa is indeed the place to look at now. Africa has got everything going for it. Starting from population growth, Africa has the highest rate of population growth in the world and sustainably maintain that for the last 50 years. Right now is about 2.7%, while the rest of the world or the entire world is growing at 1.2%. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is some 860 million people. That excludes North Africa. And with the rate of 2.7% sustainably for the next 15 years, that should add an additional 360 million people to sub-Saharan African continent. By 2050, Africa will have more than doubled its population to about 1.6 billion people. Now, obviously, that's a clear hinterland for a consumer base.
Clearly a growing consumer base with a growing middle class, but we're also competing for a limited pool of funds in an environment where there's a risk aversion, of course, right now with what's going on in Europe. And being overseas, you don't hear about Africa as much. I mean, you hear a lot about Latin America, you hear a lot about Asia. Africa, yes, is important, but it's still coming to the fore. I mean, how do you position Africa against the likes of other emerging economies and other emerging markets like LATAM and Asia?
Well, how I position Africa against other emerging economies is that Africa, yes, still has some distance to cover. But considering the availability of opportunities and the low entry points for the assets and investments, basically balancing the risk profile of the investments in sub-Saharan Africa versus the return, I think that Africa really beats other emerging or already emerged economies of the world. In terms of rate of return, internal rate of return for African assets, I think that word is already abroad that the returns for the last 15 to 20 years have been unbeatable. In terms of risk, there is the cliche that Africa is a risky place, but really, frankly speaking, ever since the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009, I think that argument has been upended. And now some of the most riskiest places to invest are indeed the traditional markets of Europe, and Asia and North America.
David,
and so I think that risk profiles have really been revised, and Africa is no longer being seen or perceived as that risky from the perspective that used to be used before.
David, we've got to go to break now, but I've got one more question for you, because Africa is not an homogenous market. Of the 54 countries, if you had to choose, say, top 3 economies to invest in from a longer term perspective, which would those be?
Well, that's a difficult question. I see Africa really long-term as an opportunity cascading from the already seemingly or relatively developed economies of Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. But if you are to put things in long-term perspective, which is really the basis of my book, it tries to project into the next 20 to 30 years. I think that the rest of Africa will have tagged along those 3 economies, and especially because of clustering around regional economic blocks where major economies in a block tend to lift the others. I think really, realistically speaking, that the rest of Africa from a long-term perspective provides a huge and a long, fantastic run for any investments opportunities.
There we have it, David Mataen, author of Africa, the Ultimate Frontier Market.